London, March 22, 1988. A regional airliner prepares for the morning service to Dublin. Among the passengers settling into their seats is Shaun O'Connor, a Provisional IRA commander responsible for orchestrating the Hyde Park bombing that killed 11 people. He orders Irish breakfast tea from the flight attendant, a pleasant woman with a soft Belfast accent who has served him dozens of times over the past year. What O'Connor doesn't know is that the woman handing him his tea is an MI6 operative who has spent 13 months constructing a flawless cover identity for this single moment. The tea is laced with an undetectable neurotoxin. Within hours, one of Britain's most wanted terrorists will be dead, and no one will ever suspect the Catholic flight attendant who smiled as she poured his drink. This is Operation Silent Flight. The woman MI6 knew as Agent M was born in Belfast in 1959. During the early years of what would become 3 decades of sectarian violence, her father died in an IRA bombing when she was 8 years old. The device had been intended for a British Army patrol. Instead, it detonated early in a Catholic neighborhood, killing 3 civilians. By age 19, M had developed the defining skill that would make her invaluable to British intelligence: the ability to disappear into any environment, to become whoever the situation required. University recruiters noticed her first. She spoke flawless Irish Gaelic, understood both Republican and Loyalist cultural codes, and possessed what one early assessment called an unusual capacity for sustained deception without psychological deterioration. MI6 approached her in 1982. The initial proposal was straightforward: short-term surveillance operations in Republican areas where British agents couldn't operate safely. M accepted. Over the next 5 years, she proved capable of something rarer than courage or linguistic skill. She could maintain a cover identity for months without the small behavioral inconsistencies that compromise most deep cover operatives. Former colleagues described her as methodical, never impulsive. She memorized details obsessively. When she played a role, she inhabited it completely. This capability made her uniquely qualified for what MI6 planners were beginning to call proximity operations. Missions requiring sustained contact with high-value targets in environments where traditional surveillance methods were impossible. By early 1986, British intelligence had concluded that Shaun O'Connor represented a strategic threat at the highest level. O'Connor commanded the Provisional IRA's England Department, the unit responsible for bombing campaigns on British soil. He had planned the Hyde Park attack in July 1982 and the Harrods bombing in December 1983. Standard surveillance had proven ineffective. O'Connor varied his routines constantly, used multiple safe houses, and maintained strict operational security. Electronic intercepts provided fragments of intelligence, but nothing actionable. The decision to eliminate him came in November 1986. Classified under the designation Executive Action Protocol 17. The strategy required rethinking how proximity to a target could be achieved. MI6 called this the embedded access doctrine. The logic was straightforward. If O'Connor's security measures prevented external surveillance, the solution was to position an operative inside his routine activities. Analysis of his travel patterns revealed a vulnerability. O'Connor flew the London to Dublin route frequently, always on the same regional airline, usually on morning services. He felt safe on these flights. The aircraft was civilian, the route was short, and the crew was familiar. Intelligence planners recognized that familiarity itself could become the weapon. The obstacles were substantial. First, inserting an agent into a commercial airline crew required creating a complete false employment history that would survive background checks. Second, the operation timeline was indeterminate. O'Connor's flight schedule was irregular, meaning the operative might maintain cover for months before the execution window opened. Third, The elimination method had to appear completely natural. Any suspicion of foul play would trigger investigations that could expose British intelligence operations throughout Ireland. Despite these challenges, planners identified the critical opportunity. O'Connor trusted routine. If an operative could become part of that routine, invisibility was achievable. Within 8 months, all elements would be in position. But first, the question of the neurotoxin needed to be resolved. The compound had to be tasteless, colorless, fast-acting enough to ensure death within hours, yet slow enough that symptoms wouldn't appear until the subject had left the aircraft. Porton Down, Britain's chemical weapons facility, had developed such compounds during the Cold War for use in scenarios exactly like this. The selected agent was a modified saxitoxin derivative that would induce what appeared to be massive stroke or cardiac arrest in subjects with pre-existing cardiovascular conditions. O'Connor's medical history, obtained through an informant within Sinn Féin, indicated chronic hypertension. The toxin would be attributed to natural causes. No autopsy would reveal the truth. During the preparation phase in autumn 1986, M experienced what intelligence handlers classify as legend drift. Her false identity as a Belfast-born flight attendant named Catherine Doyle had become more detailed than her actual background. She knew Catherine Doyle's childhood stories, her relationship history, her family in Derry, her opinions on politics and religion. In one training session, a psychologist asked M to describe her real father. She hesitated for several seconds before answering, later admitting she had momentarily confused her actual father with Catherine Doyle's fictional one. The post-operation psychological assessment would note this as a risk factor for long-term identity dissociation. But in the assessment of mission planners, this blurring was precisely what made M effective. She didn't pretend to be Catherine Doyle. She became her. Intercepted communications from January 1987 reveal O'Connor discussing his daughter's upcoming wedding. The conversation, recorded by GCHQ through a microphone inserted into a Republican safe house in Anderson's town, captured O'Connor describing the dress his daughter had chosen and his concerns about affording the reception. Analysts noted nothing operationally relevant in the exchange. O'Connor was a devoted father, careful to keep his family separated from his activities in the IRA's military wing. His daughter knew her father was involved, but not the extent of his role. When O'Connor died 15 months later, she would learn the truth from newspaper reports. The wedding photographs would later appear in Republican publications alongside articles portraying O'Connor as a martyr. By February 1987, the operation entered its execution phase. M had been successfully embedded into the airline crew, her employment history accepted without question. She began working the London-Dublin route, a routine assignment for a junior flight attendant. The window for the actual assassination was undefined. It would open whenever O'Connor next booked the flight she was working. The mission timeline could extend 6 months, 12 months, or longer. M's instructions were explicit. Maintain the Catherine Doyle identity perfectly. Wait for confirmation that O'Connor was booked on her service. Execute when the opportunity presented itself. Until then, she was simply a flight attendant serving passengers, building familiarity, becoming invisible through absolute ordinariness. The infrastructure supporting Operation Silent Flight was constructed across 3 countries over 7 months. In London, MI6's Technical Services Division created a complete employment dossier for Catherine Doyle. The documentation included payroll records backdated 18 months, tax filings, a national insurance history, and references from a previous position at a Belfast hotel that had closed in 1985. The hotel had actually existed, making verification impossible but the story plausible. Technical Services assigned the file the designation Nightingale 7, one of 43 cover identities maintained for deep penetration operations during this period. The technical equipment was minimal by design. M carried no communications devices, no cameras, no recording equipment. The neurotoxin was stored in a laboratory-grade glass vial disguised as a perfume sample, small enough to fit inside a makeup compact. The vial's exterior was etched with the logo of a French cosmetics company. If discovered during a random security check, it would appear unremarkable. The compound itself was a clear liquid, viscosity identical to water, completely odorless. Chemical analysis would identify it as saxitoxin only if examiners specifically tested for that molecule. The dosage, 0.04 milliliters, was sufficient to kill an adult male within 4 to 6 hours, assuming absorption through oral mucous membranes. The margin for error was non-existent. Too little, and O'Connor might survive with neurological damage, triggering medical investigations. Too much might cause symptoms during the flight itself. Communication protocols were equally minimalist. M received instructions through a dead drop in a London Underground station, specifically inside a newspaper dispenser at Liverpool Street Station. Her handler would insert a folded racing form into the dispenser. The race results contained encoded confirmation of O'Connor's booking. Horse names corresponded to dates, finishing positions indicated flight numbers. M checked the dead drop every Monday and Thursday morning before her shifts. The system was absurdly low-tech, but low-tech meant low risk. Electronic communications could be intercepted. Physical dead drops in a busy transit station were effectively invisible. Escape planning was unnecessary. The beauty of the operation was that M wouldn't need to escape. She would remain in her Catherine Doyle identity, continue working her shifts, and maintain the cover indefinitely. The operation called for her to stay embedded for a minimum of 7 months after the assassination, to avoid any pattern that might suggest her involvement. Only after that period would she be gradually extracted through a manufactured personal crisis. A sick relative in Belfast requiring long-term care would provide justification for leaving the airline. Her legend would remain intact, available for reactivation if needed. The team supporting M was small and compartmentalized. Surveillance specialists from Box 500, MI5's designation for counter-terrorism operations. Ulsterbert monitored O'Connor's movements throughout the operation, though they were never briefed on the ultimate objective. Their reports simply fed into GCHQ's analytical database. The execution team consisted of exactly 3 people: M herself, her direct handler, and the technical officer from Porton Down, who prepared the neurotoxin and briefed M on administration protocols. Each operative knew only their specific function. The handler didn't know the technical composition of the toxin. The technical officer didn't know M's cover identity or insertion method. M didn't know the intelligence sources that tracked O'Connor's bookings. This compartmentalization ensured that no single compromise could expose the entire operation. The planning consumed 9 months. By November 1987, M had worked 38 flights on the London-Dublin route. O'Connor had been a passenger on 6 of those services. She had served him tea 3 times, coffee twice, and orange juice once. They had exchanged perhaps 200 words total. Pleasantries about weather, comments about delays, brief exchanges about Dublin traffic. M's training had emphasized the importance of being forgettable. She was friendly, but not memorable, professional, but not distinctive. Other flight attendants on the route were more talkative, more charming, more likely to be remembered by passengers. M existed in that perfect middle ground of competent service that passengers acknowledged and immediately forgot. The operation had 18 months to run before the next phase would begin. But circumstances would accelerate the timeline. February 1987 through March 1988 represented the approach phase. During these 13 months, M worked an average of 16 flights per month, roughly 400 services total. O'Connor appeared as a passenger on 11 of these flights. The pattern of their interactions was deliberately graduated. In the first encounters, M simply served him without conversation beyond professional courtesies. By the 6th flight, she had learned his preferences: Irish breakfast tea, black, no sugar. By the 9th flight, they had progressed to brief conversations about weather and Dublin traffic conditions. O'Connor began recognizing her, nodding when he boarded, occasionally commenting on how busy the route was becoming. The escalation was imperceptible. M never initiated personal conversations. She responded to O'Connor's comments, but never pushed for deeper engagement. Intelligence assessments had identified O'Connor as cautious about forming relationships outside his immediate circle. Any flight attendant who seemed too interested in him would trigger suspicion. M's strategy was to let O'Connor define the boundaries of their interaction. She mirrored his level of engagement exactly. When he was talkative, she was pleasant and responsive. When he was quiet, she served him efficiently and moved on. This mirroring created a sense of comfort without raising questions. Over the next months, the vulnerability window began to open. GCHQ intercepts indicated O'Connor was planning increased travel to London during March 1988 for meetings with IRA Army Council members. Intelligence analysts projected he would make 3 to 4 trips during the first 3 weeks of March. M's handler confirmed through the dead drop system that O'Connor had booked the 0715-hour service on March 22nd. The message appeared in the Monday morning newspaper drop. M had 72 hours to prepare psychologically for an action she had been training toward for 19 months. March 19, 1988. M retrieved the vial from her safety deposit box at a Barclays branch in North London. The neurotoxin had been stored there since December 1986. A container labeled as perfume samples her aunt had given her. She carried it home in her handbag, indistinguishable from the cosmetics and personal items surrounding it. That evening, she rehearsed the administration procedure for the final time. The motion had to be completely natural. Lifting a teapot, pouring a cup, adding the compound from a vial palmed in her left hand while her right hand guided the pot. The entire action would take perhaps 3 seconds. Practicing the motion repeatedly risked developing an unnatural precision that would itself look suspicious. M had practiced it enough in training. Now she needed to trust her muscle memory and execute it as part of her normal service routine. March 21, 1988. M reported for her standard pre-flight briefing at 0545 hours. The shift supervisor reviewed the passenger manifest. O'Connor was listed under his known alias, Michael Brennan. The manifest noted he was seated in row 8, aisle seat. M's assignment was the forward cabin, rows 1 through 12. Everything was proceeding as intelligence had projected. The weather forecast predicted clear skies for the crossing. Flight time would be approximately 55 minutes. M prepared her service cart, loading tea service supplies according to standard procedure. The vial was in the interior pocket of her uniform jacket, positioned where she could access it with her left hand while her right hand remained visible pouring tea. By 0630 hours, all elements were in position. The aircraft was prepared for boarding. O'Connor arrived at the gate at 0642 hours, unremarkable among the business travelers and early morning commuters. He carried a leather briefcase and wore a dark suit. Gate agents processed his boarding pass without incident. He entered the aircraft at 06:53 hours, found his seat, and stowed his briefcase in the overhead compartment. The cabin crew completed their pre-flight safety checks. M stood in the forward galley, outwardly calm, her training overriding the physiological stress response that threatened to compromise her composure. In post-operation debriefing, she would describe this moment as the only time during the entire operation when she questioned whether she could execute. The doubt lasted approximately 5 seconds. Then the professional discipline reasserted itself. She was Catherine Doyle, flight attendant, beginning another routine service. What O'Connor didn't know as he settled into his seat was that every element of M's morning routine had been choreographed for this specific moment. The timing of when she would begin beverage service, the sequence in which she would approach passengers, the exact moment when she would reach row 8. Intelligence planners had calculated that 18 to 22 minutes into the flight was optimal, long enough after takeoff that passengers were relaxed, early enough that the full beverage service would appear routine. M would approach O'Connor's row at approximately 07:33 hours. The method about to be used was invisible. No weapon, no struggle, no evidence that would survive the subject's metabolic processes. The aircraft departed London at 07:17 hours, 2 minutes behind schedule due to ground traffic delays. M began beverage service at 07:29 hours, starting from the forward rows and working backward. She served coffee to 2 passengers in row 3, tea to a woman in row 5, orange juice to a businessman in row 6. The routine was identical to hundreds of previous services. Her movements were practiced, efficient, unremarkable. She reached row 8 at 07:35 hours. O'Connor looked up from the newspaper he was reading. "Morning, Catherine," he said, using the name she had introduced herself with months earlier. "Irish breakfast tea, Michael?" she responded, using his alias naturally. He nodded. M lifted the teapot from her cart with her right hand. The motion was smooth, practiced from thousands of repetitions. Her left hand reached into her jacket pocket, extracting the vial with her thumb and forefinger. The vial was warm from being against her body, which made it easier to handle. She positioned the teacup on O'Connor's tray table with her right hand, while her left hand came up smoothly, thumb pressing the vial's release mechanism. The compound dispensed silently into the cup. 0.04 milliliters of clear liquid that mixed invisibly with the dark tea. Total time from extracting the vial to returning it to her pocket: 2.8 seconds. Her hands never trembled. O'Connor never glanced away from his newspaper. She poured the tea with her right hand, filling the cup 3/4 full as per O'Connor's established preference. The neurotoxin was completely integrated into the liquid. Chemical properties ensured it wouldn't separate or form visible particulates. "There you are," M said. "Thank you, love," O'Connor replied, setting down his newspaper to add milk from the small container she provided. He stirred the tea briefly and took his first sip while M was still standing beside his row, serving coffee to the passenger across the aisle. The compound began absorbing through his oral mucous membranes immediately, passing into his bloodstream within seconds. The saxitoxin derivative would bind to sodium channels in his nervous system over the next several hours, progressively disrupting neural signaling until catastrophic system failure occurred. The flight continued without incident. M completed the beverage service, cleared used cups and containers at the 20-minute mark, and conducted the pre-landing safety check as the aircraft descended toward Dublin. O'Connor finished his tea, read his newspaper, and stared out the window during the final approach. He showed no symptoms. The toxin had been calibrated to delay effects for 4 to 6 hours, ensuring symptoms would appear long after the flight concluded, and multiple alibis would exist for every crew member. At 0812 hours, the aircraft touched down at Dublin Airport. Passengers began collecting their belongings and preparing to disembark. O'Connor exited the Withdrawal aircraft at 0821 hours. M stood at the forward door, saying goodbye to passengers as they departed, standard procedure for the crew. "Safe travels," she said to O'Connor as he passed. He nodded and smiled, the brief acknowledgement of someone who had seen her dozens of times over the past year. Then he was gone, disappearing into the terminal with the other passengers. M would never see him again. She cleaned the forward cabin, prepared the aircraft for the return service to London, and completed her duties exactly as she would on any normal day. Within 90 minutes, she was serving beverages on the return flight. Nothing in her demeanor suggested that anything unusual had occurred. While M continued her shift 600 meters away in the terminal, O'Connor proceeded through customs without delay. Irish authorities had no reason to detain him. He was traveling under a known alias. But the Irish government had a complex relationship with the Provisional IRA. Active intervention against senior IRA figures was politically sensitive. O'Connor exited the terminal at 0847 hours and took a taxi to a Sinn Féin office in central Dublin. The taxi driver would later tell investigators that his passengers seemed normal, perhaps slightly tired, but nothing remarkable. The journey took 28 minutes through morning traffic. O'Connor arrived at the Sinn Féin office at 0915 hours. He attended a meeting that lasted approximately 90 minutes, discussing logistics for an upcoming fundraising event in Boston. Attendees would later report that O'Connor participated normally in the discussion, showed no signs of physical distress, and ate a light lunch of sandwiches and coffee. The first symptoms appeared around 11:45 hours. O'Connor mentioned feeling warm and asked someone to open a window. He complained of tingling in his hands, a symptom consistent with early-stage neurological disruption. A colleague suggested he might be coming down with flu. By 12:15 hours, O'Connor's symptoms had progressed significantly. He experienced difficulty focusing his vision and reported numbness spreading from his extremities toward his core. These symptoms reflected the saxitoxin's systematic blocking of sodium channel function, progressively paralyzing voluntary muscle control. A colleague drove him to a safe house in Ballsbridge, a residential Dublin neighborhood where IRA members frequently stayed. O'Connor reached the safe house at 12:32 hours. He lay down, believing rest would help. The colleague stayed with him, growing increasingly concerned as O'Connor's breathing became labored. At 13:08 hours, approximately 5 hours and 33 minutes after consuming the poisoned tea, Shaun O'Connor suffered complete respiratory failure. The saxitoxin had progressively paralyzed his respiratory muscles until mechanical breathing became impossible. His heart stopped. Minutes later, the colleague attempted CPR while another person called emergency services. Paramedics arrived at 13:24 hours. They attempted resuscitation for 18 minutes, but could not restart cardiac function. O'Connor was pronounced dead at 13:42 hours, March 22, 1988. The attending physician, unfamiliar with sophisticated poisoning methods and noting O'Connor's history of hypertension, initially classified the death as probable cardiac arrest. An autopsy was ordered as standard procedure for sudden deaths. The pathologist documented massive system failure consistent with stroke or heart attack in a subject with pre-existing cardiovascular disease. Toxicology screening tested for common poisons, street drugs, and alcohol. Saxitoxin was not part of standard toxicology panels. The compound's metabolic breakdown products were chemically similar to naturally occurring molecules, making detection nearly impossible without specific testing protocols that had no reason to be employed. The official cause of death was recorded as acute myocardial infarction secondary to chronic hypertensive cardiovascular disease. No suspicious circumstances were noted. Within 7 months, M had completed 54 additional flights on the same route. She maintained the Catherine Doyle identity perfectly, showing no behavioral changes that might suggest involvement in anything unusual. In October 1988, she informed her supervisor that her mother in Belfast was ill and required long-term care. She requested a leave of absence. The airline approved her request without question. Employee turnover among flight attendants was common, and Catherine Doyle had been a reliable, unremarkable crew member. She never returned to the position. The Catherine Doyle identity was retired into MI6 archives, available for reactivation but never used again. M underwent 3 months of psychological debriefing and evaluation before being cleared for other assignments. By late March 1988, Irish police and Sinn Féin security personnel understood that O'Connor's death appeared natural, but occurred under convenient circumstances. Every lead investigators pursued ended in mundane explanations. The tea had come from standard airline supplies. The flight attendant who served him was a Catholic woman from Belfast, with no apparent intelligence connections. Her background check revealed exactly what MI6 had constructed it to reveal. An ordinary working-class woman with no political affiliations beyond voting patterns typical for her community. The investigation's inability to find anything suspicious was itself mildly suspicious to experienced intelligence officers. But its suspicion without evidence leads nowhere. Sinn Féin issued a statement mourning O'Connor as a tireless advocate for Irish reunification who had died unexpectedly from natural causes. British authorities maintained silence. The denials were transparent to professionals in both intelligence communities. But transparency wasn't the point. The point was deniability. The operation achieved multiple strategic objectives. Tactically, the elimination of O'Connor disrupted the Provisional IRA's England department at a critical moment. O'Connor had been planning a series of bombing operations scheduled for spring 1988. His death forced a leadership reorganization that delayed those operations by months. Intelligence gained from monitoring Republican communications after his death included assessments of internal IRA command structure and identified 3 previously unknown operatives who became targets for subsequent surveillance operations. Secondary benefits included demonstrating to Republican leadership that British intelligence capabilities extended into environments they had considered secure. What the operation cost was significant but calibrated. Diplomatic relations with the Irish government remained strained but not catastrophically damaged. Dublin suspected British involvement but lacked evidence and had limited interest in pursuing investigations that would complicate an already tense political situation. Operationally, silent flight revealed nothing about British tradecraft. The method was invisible, the agent remained uncompromised, and the infrastructure supporting the operation was completely compartmentalized. Human costs were concentrated on M herself, who experienced psychological effects consistent with prolonged deep-cover work. Post-operation evaluations documented symptoms of dissociative identity patterns and difficulty reintegrating into normal intelligence work. She completed 2 additional assignments before requesting permanent transfer to analytical roles in 1991. MI6's assessment was that strategic benefits substantially outweighed operational costs. Whether this proved correct would become clear over the following years as the Northern Ireland peace process developed. O'Connor's absence removed a hardline voice from Republican military councils at a moment when moderates were beginning to consider negotiated settlements. Some historians argue silent flight contributed to creating political space for eventual peace negotiations. Others contend that targeted assassinations, however surgical, perpetuated cycles of violence that made reconciliation more difficult. The answer reveals more about analytical frameworks than about the operation itself. Was O'Connor a legitimate military target in an undeclared war? Or was he a political figure assassinated by a government that claimed to uphold rule of law? Supporters of operations like silent flight argue that individuals who plan mass casualty attacks forfeit normal protections and become legitimate targets for elimination. The Hyde Park bombing killed 11 people and wounded 50 others. O'Connor bore direct command responsibility. Critics argue that extrajudicial killing, regardless of the target's actions, undermines democratic principles and establishes precedents that justify increasingly broad uses of state violence. O'Connor never faced trial, never confronted evidence, never had opportunity for defense. The paradox is irreducible. M carried out an assassination that likely prevented future bombings, but did so through deception that made normal legal process impossible. She became something between soldier and murderer, operating in spaces where those categories blur beyond recognition. What's your take on operations that eliminate individuals planning mass violence, but do so outside legal frameworks? Drop your perspective in the comments. If this story made you reconsider assumptions about intelligence work and the costs paid by people who operate in classified worlds, hit that like button and share this with someone who appreciates complexity over easy answers.